The most feared machines on D-Day were the ones the British generals wanted to throw in the scrap heap. They called them a circus, a joke on tracks, clown tanks. And for a while, everyone laughed. Picture a bunker on the Normandy coast. Dawn, the 6th of June 1944, a German gunner leans into the cold slit of concrete and watches the gray sea heave. 6 feet of reinforced wall wraps around him. Mines seed the sand below. Steel stakes wait in the shallows. This is Rommel's Atlantic Wall, the most fortified coastline on Earth. He is not afraid. Why would he be? He has seen what happens when men storm a beach like this. He has heard about Dieppe, the tanks that crawled ashore and died on the stones. Let the Tommies come. Let them try. The sea in front of him is empty, safe, ordinary. And then, the sea stands up. Shapes rise out of the waves, not landing craft. Tanks, actual tanks climbing out of deep water where no tank should float, shrugging off canvas skins, rolling up the sand with their guns already turning. He blinks. His mind refuses it. Down the beach, something else is screaming, a machine flogging the ground with spinning chains. And the mines he trusted are cooking off in harmless little thumps. 30 seconds ago, he was laughing. Now the concrete around him feels very, very thin. This is the story of the strangest tanks ever built. The story of the man they humiliated and cast out, and the weapons his own army very nearly refused to use. To understand why these machines mattered, you have to understand the nightmare they were built to solve. By 1942, the Allies knew the truth. Sooner or later, they would have to invade France. And to do it, they would have to attempt the single hardest thing in all of warfare: attack a fortified beach, head on. A beach is a trap. There is no cover, no trees, no walls, no way to dig in. Just flat open sand watched by guns that have been ranged on every inch of it for years. The enemy sits behind concrete. You arrive in the open, wet and exhausted. For a few terrible minutes, you are completely exposed. And every one of those minutes carries a price paid in men. The Allies had already learned this lesson. The hard way. August 1942. The raid on Dieppe. Nearly 6,000 men, most of them Canadians, struck a defended French port to test the German coast. It was a disaster. The tanks came ashore and found the beach was loose stone. Their tracks churned. They bogged down. They sat there, stranded, unable to climb the seawall, while the guns did their work. In a single morning, around 60% of that force was lost. Killed, wounded, or captured. Dieppe screamed one message across every Allied planning room. If you land troops on a beach the normal way, they are cut down before the tanks can ever help them. Because the tanks always came too late. They drowned in the surf, or they landed after the first wave was already pinned in the sand. The infantry hit the beach alone and paid for it. So the planners faced an impossible sum. To liberate Europe, they had to cross that deadly beach. But crossing it the old way meant thousands of casualties in the first hour. They needed the tanks to arrive first, to swim, to clear the mines, to smash the walls, to do things tanks simply could not do. They needed a miracle made of steel. And the one man who could build it had just been thrown out of the army. His name was Percy Hobart. And by every measure, the British High Command had decided he was finished. Hobart was a tank man to his bones. One of the great early prophets of armored warfare, a soldier who understood, long before most, that fast-moving tanks would decide the next war. He had trained the men who became the legendary Desert Rats. He saw the future clearly. That was exactly the problem. Hobart was brilliant, blunt, and utterly certain he was right, usually, because he was. He argued. He pushed. He had no patience for cautious, old-fashioned officers who wanted to fight the next war like the last one. He made powerful enemies. And in 1940, those enemies won. Hobart was stripped of his command, judged too difficult, too radical, too much. One of the finest armored minds in Britain was quietly shown the door and forced into retirement. Think about how far he fell. A general who had commanded whole divisions of tanks, pulled a uniform back on again as a lance corporal in the Home Guard. The lowest of the low. He spent his days drilling farmers and shopkeepers in a quiet English village, standing watch with a rifle, guarding a country that had decided it no longer wanted his mind. The establishment had thrown away a genius. But one man noticed. The military thinker Basil Liddell Hart wrote publicly about the scandal that such rare talent was rotting in the ranks, while Britain fought for its very life. Word reached Winston Churchill. Churchill was furious. He did not care that Hobart was awkward, or that he ruffled feathers. Britain, he argued, could not afford to fight a war using only the officers who had upset nobody. Difficult men win battles. So Churchill hauled Percy Hobart back from the wilderness. And he handed him a strange new command, a division that barely existed yet, with a near impossible job attached. Solve the beach. Build the tanks that could do the undoable. The discarded man now had one chance to prove all of them wrong. And he would take it with machines so bizarre that grown generals would burst out laughing the moment they laid eyes on them. On paper, they were the 79th Armored Division. Everyone else called them Hobart's Funnies. Because they were funny. They looked absurd. They looked like something wheeled out of a nightmare fairground, not fielded by the most serious army on earth. And the first time senior officers saw them, many simply could not keep a straight face. Start with the swimming tank. Someone had taken a 30-ton steel Sherman, a machine built to sink like an anchor, and wrapped a tall canvas screen around it, like a giant paddling pool strapped to its hull. 2 little propellers spun at the back. The theory was that this fabric skirt would push enough water aside to let the whole heavy monster float, and gently putter its way to shore under its own power. Men took one look and nicknamed it the Donald Duck. A floating tank, held up by canvas and hope. It sounded insane. Then there was the flail tank, the Crab. Bolted to the front was a great spinning drum, and hanging off that drum were dozens of heavy chains. As the tank crawled forward, the drum whirled, and those chains beat the ground ahead of it like a furious, oversized carpet beater hammering the earth, flinging up dust and stones in a chaotic storm. It looked ridiculous. A tank throwing a tantrum. And then, the one that made the laughing stop, the Crocodile. An ordinary-looking Churchill tank, dragging a small armored trailer behind it. But that trailer was packed with fuel. And from the front of the tank reached a nozzle that could throw a jet of fire further than the length of a football pitch. There were others, too, tanks that unrolled a giant carpet over soft ground so vehicles wouldn't sink into it. Tanks that carried great bundles of timber to drop into ditches. Tanks that folded out into bridges. Engineer tanks bristling with tools no other army had bothered to build. To the traditional generals, it was a punchline, a traveling circus of gimmicks. Real tanks had a gun and armor, not paddling pools and chains and rolls of carpet. They laughed. But Hobart wasn't building toys. Every single clownish feature had a cold, exact purpose. Each one answered a specific way that men had died at Dieppe. The canvas skirt meant the tanks could arrive with the first wave not long after it. The chains meant a safe path punched straight through a minefield. The fire meant the concrete could finally be broken open. The circus was an answer, written in steel. And it was about to go to war. Because here is what the laughing generals missed. The Funnies didn't just break walls and clear mines, they broke minds. Start again with the swimming tanks rising out of the sea at dawn. Put yourself back inside that bunker. Your entire defense rests on one simple belief: tanks come from boats, and boats we can see coming. The water itself is safe. It is a wall of nothing. Then, the water gives birth to tanks. Dark shapes heave up out of the waves, shed their canvas skins, and grind up the sand with their guns already swinging toward you. Your brain has no box for this. The sea is not supposed to attack. For a few frozen seconds, you don't even fire, you just stare. And those seconds now belong to the enemy. Next, the flail tanks go to work. A minefield is meant to be a barrier of pure fear, invisible, patient, waiting. Cross it and you take terrible losses, so the defenders relax behind it. It buys them time. It does their fighting for them. Then a crab rolls up and starts beating the ground, Its chains whip and crack. The mines that were meant to shred an entire advance simply cook off under the flails in dull, wasted thumps, a hollow ba-thump marching steadily forward. In minutes, a clean lane opens straight through the barrier that was supposed to hold for hours. The wall of fear just evaporates. But the deepest terror had no equal. The crocodile. A hardened defender will trade bullets with bullets all day long. It is a fair fight, and he knows the rules. But there is one thing that reaches past training and doctrine and courage, something older, wired into every human being who has ever lived. The fear of fire. When a crocodile turned toward a strong point and let loose that long, roaring jet of flame, defenders who would never have surrendered to gunfire threw down their weapons and ran. The threat alone was enough. Often the fire didn't even need to reach them. The mere sight of it emptied positions that machine guns could never have taken. And then came the rumors. Down the length of the Atlantic Wall, whispers spread faster than any tank could roll. The British have machines that swim, tanks that walk through minefields untouched, tanks that breathe fire. Fear did the fighting before the guns ever had to. And the men who had laughed loudest at the paddling pool tanks were now the ones abandoning their concrete and running for the trees. On the morning of the 6th of June 1944, 5 beaches were stormed at once, and they did not all get the same tools. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Funnies led the way in. The swimming tanks came ashore with the first men. The flails tore open lanes through the mines. The engineer tanks cracked the walls and bridged the ditches. Troops who had braced for a massacre found paths already opening up in front of them. They pushed inland. The fighting was hard. The cost was real. But set against the nightmare everyone had feared, those beaches held. The clown tanks worked. And then there was Omaha. The Americans had been offered Hobart's full toolbox. Every strange, brilliant machine in it. The flails, the fire tanks, the engineers, all of it, freely shared. They said no. They took the swimming tanks, but turned down almost all the rest. There were reasons given: time, training, a preference for their own methods, a quiet doubt that these odd British contraptions were really worth it. But underneath it ran a colder current, a reluctance to fight the way another army was telling them to. That decision was paid for at Omaha. Even the swimming tanks they did bring were launched far too early, into water far rougher than the fabric skirts could ever handle. Of 29 tanks put into the sea in one sector, 27 never reached the shore. So the men who waded onto Omaha arrived almost alone. No flails beating safe lanes through the mines, no fire tanks silencing the bunkers. Just infantry, in the open against uncut wire and untouched concrete, and every gun still firing. They were pinned down in the surf for hours. Omaha became the deadliest beach of the entire invasion, casualties running into the thousands on that single stretch of sand. And just a few miles away, on the British beaches, those very same defenses were being cracked wide open by the exact machines Omaha had waved away. That was the cruel arithmetic of D-Day. On one length of coast, the strange tanks opened the door. On another, pride slammed it shut, and the bill came due along the tide line. Percy Hobart never got a hero's parade. The man they demoted, humiliated, and very nearly erased was proven completely right in a single morning. His impossible circus had done exactly what he swore it would. It had beaten the beach. It had spared a generation of young men the fate of Dieppe. Then, quietly, the story moved on without him. The Funnies were eventually scrapped or forgotten. The awkward genius faded into the background of a victory he had helped to build his name, known to almost none of the people who owed him their grandfather's life. But the machines had the last laugh. So go back, one final time, to that bunker on the Normandy coast. The gray dawn, the German gunner leaning into the cold concrete, watching an empty sea, certain that he was safe. Certain the Tommies and their ridiculous tanks were no threat to him at all. He had, perhaps, 30 seconds of that certainty left. 30 seconds before the sea stood up, before the chains began to scream, before the fire came rolling toward the wall he had trusted with his life. 30 seconds to laugh at Britain's clown tanks before D-Day turned serious.